So, good afternoon. Language, Korean English. I am Reglito Alrtich Imbong, Assistant Professor of Philosophy of UP Cebu. I've been teaching for 5 years, but I started teaching in UP Cebu last year, 2014.
Number one question, sir. When did you decide to become a teacher, and why did you choose this field?
Actually, teaching was not one among my ambitions in life. In fact, uh, when I was in college, I took up philosophy because I was a seminarian, so I have a goal of being a priest or a brother someday. But it was only during my third year in college, perhaps, that I had the desire. After I went out from the seminary, I had the desire in teaching, especially when my brother also was hired as a professor in a university in Manila, still teaching philosophy, and I was also inspired to teach philosophy in college. So basically, the desire to teach just come up when I was in college, when I was so interested in philosophy, uh, in awakening the consciousness of the students with regards what's happening in society, with regards to social issues, because basically philosophy is all about being critical, being aware of society, and of course providing solutions to this. And that's where I began to love teaching.
Next question, sir. What do you like most about teaching as a career?
What I like most perhaps is the opportunity to be able to impart to students, to the younger generation, ideas. Because I believe in today's generation, when everything is instant, the desire for ideas is just so impossible, if not difficult, for students. And so it is, I find it my obligation to allow students to be acquainted, to be introduced with ideas that are most of all liberating and emancipating. And of course, what I like most about this is when through introducing students with different theories, with different ideas, I discovered that they actually practice what they learned in the real life, especially in applying this to society in general, in how they deal with people, and how they use these theories in order to analyze certain issues and present their alternatives to these issues that are currently experienced or suffered by the people.
Why do you think, sir, na younger generations should be teach about philosophy, and why not teach a higher level, like graduate school? Why are you teaching sa college?
In fact, not only in college is philosophy most or important, but also even in high school, because, and that's also one of the thrust of the K-12, right? Introducing philosophy in the senior high school, because this is so important, because in today's generation, when neoliberalism or globalization has strongly influenced our educational system, there is the drive to downplay the significance, the importance, and the role of the social sciences and the humanities, and that includes philosophy. That's why little by little there is the rationalization scheme of our educational system to close or not to offer anymore social sciences courses and humanities courses. So we, for example, from the philosophy, from those coming from the field of philosophy, strongly urge the government to introduce philosophical courses, especially those that are critical, that allow students to articulate discourse so that students will not just be mere passive in being a Filipino, for example, so that they will not just be complacent, but rather they will contribute because they think critically, they will contribute and think for themselves what it is that they can contribute for society. And this is important, again, not only in the graduate courses, but also and most especially in the high school and in the college courses.
Next question is, what is your philosophy of education?
My philosophy of education. I am strongly influenced by the emancipatory education proposed by Paulo Freire from Brazil. And in fact, his philosophy of education greatly inspired my MA thesis, which is about critical pedagogy. So basically for me, education, from its etymology, educare, is nothing more but liberating students from ignorance. And what do we mean by ignorance in today's world? Ignorance is basically the sense of apathy, a sense of being indifferent from what's happening in today's world, the sense of the sense of simply living up to what is being presented to us by the system, by the capitalist system. Ignorance is like being a full-blown consumerist without really the desire to think what it is that is essential for life. So education is about liberating students from this state of ignorance. Not just students, but basically people out from this state of ignorance. It's like Plato's allegory of the cave. I may say that philosophy majors or philosophy enthusiasts or philosophers in general are those liberated prisoners who desire to emancipate as well the enslaved prisoners in the cave, so that they could see the truth, or that which is good, or that which is knowledge. So that's my philosophy of education. So in general, when I say philosophy of education, I believe that it is something which emancipates people, which is something that liberates people, which allows people to think, and not just simply to do what the system tells them to do, but to think and be critical of what the system is telling them.
Next question, sir. What are some of the most significant things you learned from your students?
From my students. Actually, every after semester, I try to assess my teaching, or my methods of teaching, and also the content of what I teach. And I discover a lot based from the questions that the students ask, and also with the personal consultations that the student that I and my students are doing. So what I learned basically from my students is the sense of openness, meaning I must not act as someone who knows everything, okay, but rather always listen, but someone who is always open to criticisms, so that I may know how to improve my style of teaching, or the contents of my teaching.
So in connection to that, sir, describe the teaching techniques or strategies that are most effective for you.
I'm not an education graduate, sadly. My AB course did not even have any education units, and so I do not have the knowledge in, how do you call that, teaching techniques or whatsoever. I don't know. Perhaps I'm quite a boring teacher because I do lectures a lot. And that's basically what philosophy teachers do. And that's what I acquired also from my professors, because we just basically do lecture, because it's hard to make activities about Plato's allegory of the cave, for example, or Hegel's dialectical idealism. And you just simply need to discuss this, to have lectures on this. But one thing that I can incorporate with my teaching strategies is humor. I don't know if it is effective, but I tried my best to at least integrate or to include humor in my teaching, so that at least my students will not get bored during classes.
And next, okay. What would you do if 50% of your class did poorly on a test?
I actually have experienced that, and personally, I don't want to fail students. Anyways, it's the students who want to fail themselves. But what I usually do in those situations is to give removals and to allow students to get higher grades or higher scores by the next time, or by the time they have taken the removals.
Okay. Next is, describe your fears as you being in your first year teaching.
My fears. I think I started teaching when I was 21 or 23. Not 23. I started teaching when I was still 23, and I still had hair during that time, which means to say, most of my students will really think that I'm just a student also. So even the dean told me beforehand, or before the start of the class, that I could be, I look like a student. So that's one thing that I actually feared, that students will not respect me because we're just of the same age. They might think that way. And also, I fear that I might not be too effective to them. I think that's that's the fear that teachers usually think, because you might just be doing lectures there without being really effective to your students. That's why I tried my best to really assess whether or not I have been effective in one way or another, and I have means actually to gauge on my effectivity.
Last question, sir. How would you balance your time being a university teacher and as an activist or husband?
Balance my time. Time. What's that? No. Ever since when I was a college student, I think this is one of the things that I am really proud about myself, because I know how to manage my time. If I really have to wake up 4 a.m. or 3 a.m. or to sleep 10 p.m. or 11 p.m., I have to do that just to be able to properly manage my time and to allocate my time if ever some people will be needing it. So being a teacher and an activist, for example, is not really that hard, because I consider myself as a teacher militant. In fact, that's the term I coined in my thesis. Being a teacher in the university is not just about isolating yourself from what's happening from society, but rather bringing society into the classroom so that students can see for themselves what's happening in society. Because being an activist is not just about walking in the streets or marching in the streets, although that's necessary, or that's an essential part. But being an activist also includes educating students, explaining to them the nature of our society, the history of our society, current problems we are experiencing. So basically, I don't have enough problems, except for, of course, for some conflicting schedules. When, for example, my organization calls for a meeting and it's actually it's time for classes, for example, or I have scheduled classes. But being a professor in the university actually has three or tripartite obligations. Okay, we have threefold obligations: teaching, research, and extension. So what I do with my extension service or community service is basically to incorporate it with my activism. So say for example, extension work in Yolanda affected areas. So as a social scientist, I also need to explain to those victims of Yolanda, which we are commemorating this Sunday, with the efforts of the government with regards to relief, rehabilitation, and recovery. And in that way, I could also raise their consciousness about how, for example, the government fails in some respects. So, which means to say, I hit two birds in one stone. Being a professor, as well as being an activist in one activity. And being a husband, of course, that entails time, because you have to give time for your wife. But actually, before I get married, I have already explained to my wife who I really am, because I've been an activist for one third of my life, and that has been part of my blood actually. Anyway, so I tried to explain to her that what I am doing actually as an activist is not just for the oppressed, it's not just for the marginalized, but it also includes us, both of us.